We can also have emotional product motives, right? So those specifically are the impulses which persuade you to buy something because of your emotion. And so, it could be that you're watching something on TV and it makes you cry. It could also be, that the commercial makes you cry. It could also be that you're watching a television show that made you really happy, and in the middle of it, you saw an ad for something and you decided, I'm going to buy that product immediately, right? Or you go in a store and you're trying to find the best spaghetti you can because you want to feed your family, excuse me, and you see a picture of a baby on the spaghetti package, and that drives your heart crazy, and so you decide to buy some spaghetti. um, On the other hand, you can have rational product motives, and those are the impulses that arise, for a product based on logical analysis and proper evaluation. I just bought a new television. I bought a television 2 years ago. It was a Toshiba. It broke. I'm not going to say anything negative about the brand, but if we weren't, if this wasn't recorded, I probably would. I mean, what kind of TV just completely goes dead in 2 years? And I probably only turned the TV on like 20 times in 2 years. I mean, it's insane. Anyway, but now when I made the decision to buy a new television, you better believe that I did a lot of logical analysis. How much money do I want to spend? What do the reviews say? What does the warranty look like? All of these things. Very rational decision. And in this case, I was really looking at, both the product and the brand. But we can do the same thing. I live across the street from San Morello. San Morello has been open for a decent amount of time, what, like a year and a half, 2 years, something like this. I've only eaten there once, right? And I've only eaten there once because I don't know anybody in Detroit who actually wants to eat at San Morello. It doesn't matter where they come from or their backgrounds. They're like, oh, that's really expensive for pasta. I can just make pasta at home. I've only ever been there once, and that was with a girlfriend of mine from New York. She came in and we went to San Morello, and I liked it. But there that is. Okay, that's rational product motives.
So another group of motives are manifest versus latent motives. So I really like these motives. So manifest motives are motives that are known and freely admitted. Let me say this again. Manifest motives are motives that are known and freely admitted, while latent motives are either unknown to the consumer or are such that he or she is reluctant to admit them. And I'll give you examples. So let's say you decided to purchase a Cadillac. So you want a Caddy. Manifest motives. So motives that you know and you will tell anyone who asks. You decided that you wanted to purchase a Cadillac because it's comfortable. It's a large car and it's comfortable. Um, you decided to purchase a Cadillac because it's high quality and you believe it performs well. And you could even say something like, oh, I chose to purchase a Cadillac because a number of my friends own Cadillacs, right? All great. On the other hand, you might have latent motives, motives that either you don't know or you don't want to admit. So, for example, you could think of you want a caddy because it will demonstrate to other people that you're successful, right? Maybe this is something that you're thinking to yourself or something that is in your thought process, but it's subconscious. Um, or it could be something like it's a powerful, sexy car and it will help make me feel powerful and sexy. Again, that could be a latent motive, something that you either think but you're unwilling to tell people, or you don't really know that because it's a subconscious thought.
We can also talk about utilitarian versus hedonic motives. So, utilitarian motivation is when you have this drive to acquire products that can be used to accomplish something, right? So, you buy cleaning supply, or I just bought some new storage containers, right? Because I need to store some stuff, or moving boxes because you need to move, or hiring movers, right? That's a service. And you do that because, again, you need to move. Um, Hedonic motivation, though, is when you have a drive to experience something emotionally gratifying, right? So you can choose to shop with retailers who are seen as fun and exciting. So you might decide that you're going to shop at Patagonia because you like their sustainability beliefs. Or you could shop at Disney World or go to Disney World because you like the fun and excitement associated with Disney World. Or you can decide that you only want to go to vegan restaurants because you support veganism and this idea of cruelty-free eating. You can download Snapchat or you can download Instagram. And some people do things like create Instagram feeds where they follow people who give them positive energy, right? So we see some people who follow therapists because they offer these kind of therapeutic ideas. We see people in the plus size. So I study plus size consumers, but in the plus size community, we see people who will create their own Instagram feeds where they follow a lot of positive, body positive or plus size fashion people. Or, you might be into skating and you might start following skaters, something like this. So, those are examples. So, another classification of motives is unconscious versus conscious motives. Conscious motives are motives we are aware of. The reasons for our behavior are clear, and we don't need to be aroused to kind of pursue these motives. Um, so, for example, you could decide that you want great grades, right? You're very aware of it. It's very clear. You could decide you want to be an entrepreneur, right? The reasons for your behavior are very clear. You know what your motives are here. At the same time, there are motives that we aren't aware of, and those motives create this behavior that we also are kind of confused about. And we've all experienced this where you look back and you go, but why did I do that? Right? Why did I do XYZ? That happens all the time. A lot of times when that happens, it's because our motivation is unconscious, right? One thing about unconscious motives is that unconscious biases often will fall under the umbrella of unconscious motives. Um, and there's this really interesting article in HBR by Johnson et al. I know I always say articles are interesting, but as I've mentioned before, I'm pretty curious and I could pretty much almost find everything interesting. So the title of the article, if there's only one woman in your candidate pool, there's statistically no chance she'll be hired. What they do to prove this, and they do this with both race and gender, I should start off by saying. So what they do is they have participants um, read 3 bios of potential employees, but they also tell the participants the makeup of the job itself. So they may say, hey, we already have 5 people who are doing this job, like CEO or just regular workers, whatever. And they'll say, let's say, all 5 of them are white men, right? Let's just say that that's the case. Oftentimes, when you're hiring for kind of certain positions, this could be true. What they find is if all of the people or most of the people who are already hired are white men, if the bios show, let's say, one woman or one person of color and 2 white men, people are going to choose a white man, right? Because a lot of times we have this unconscious bias and this unconscious motive to preserve status quo. On the other hand, what they find, and this is what I think is really interesting, is that even if you tell the participants that the current employees are white men, if you change the people who are being looked at, these potential employees, such that 2 of them are women, 2 out of 3 of them are women, or 2 out of 3 of them are people of color, the people are much more likely to say, let's hire a woman or a person of color. And what Johnson and all argue is that when you change the dynamics of who's in the eligibility pool, right? You've already changed status quo, right? Having 2 women out of 3 candidates changes status quo. We rarely see a situation where there's a job where everybody else is already white men, but the applicant pool is 66%, almost 67% of them are people of color or women. So you've already changed status quo, and people who are hiring will feel more comfortable hiring someone that is not in that status quo category because you've already changed status quo. Anyway, very interesting article. I definitely recommend that you skim it. I think it's super interesting.
So we can have what we call positive motivation and negative motivation. So positive motivation is a driving force towards some object or a condition. It leads us to have an approach goal. So we want to approach something, right? Um, on the other hand, negative motivation is a driving force away from something, some object or condition. It leads to an avoidance goal, right? So I might have an approach goal towards, let's say, the mall, and I might have a avoidance goal toward the DMV, right? So maybe I have a positive goal towards going to the mall, right? I'm going to go to the mall on Saturday to treat myself. On the other hand, I kind of have an avoidance goal where I say something like, I am going to renew my tags online for the rest of my life so that I can avoid the DMV, right? So these kind of things happen. So there are several types of motives, and we're going to talk about several throughout the next several slides. The first that I'm going to kind of talk about are rational versus emotional motives. A rational motive implies that consumers select a brand or product or market offering based on totally objective criteria. In this case, if we're talking about a car, it would be things like the size of the car, the weight of the car, the price of the car, MPG, so on and so forth. Emotional motives imply that consumers select a brand or a product or a service or a market offering according to personal or subjective criteria, in which in the case of a car could be things like the color, their affection for a specific brand, or the prestige associated with a brand. I would ask you to think about this. How do you think a lot of consumers choose cars? Do you think that they use rational motives or emotional motives? If I were taking a guess, I would say they use some combination of both. So sure, there are some consumers who are completely rational, and there are some consumers who are completely emotional. But I would say for the majority of consumers, it's somewhere in the middle, right? These things aren't mutually exclusive. So consumers usually use some combination of both. So maybe what they decide to do is look at things like I only want a sedan, I want it to be four-door, and I want it to have X miles per gallon. At the same time, I have an affinity for the color red, and I've always liked Beamers, and so I'm gonna go with a red Beamer that meets these criteria. This makes sense to me, and I would argue that this is probably how a lot of people choose cars.
There are some other consumer motives, and a lot of the motives that I list here are motives that really, not solely, but really impact Americans. We have an achievement motive, right? We want to achieve and experience emotions connected to positive evaluations. We have a power motive where we want to control or influence other people, things, groups, activities, so on and so forth. A need for novelty and uniqueness. So we have this need in a lot of cases, or want or desire to perceive yourself as different. If you talk to me, if you've ever heard me talk about this before, I will say that we are somewhat unique. but a lot of times we're not that unique. People tend to be pretty similar. Affiliation, we have drive to be with people, and then self-esteem. Self-esteem is huge. We have this need to maintain a positive self-view. I'll talk about this specifically in other classes, but this is a huge motive that a lot of us have. We want to maintain a positive self-view, and we do a lot of things to perpetuate a positive self-view.
One thing to remember as marketers is that ads reinforce motives. So ads again reinforce motives which lead us to act, right? So this ad for exercise shows men a desired state, let's say, nice body, and suggest a solution to attain it, right? So the ad in and of itself can inspire consumers to act, right? It could inspire consumers to actually buy this solo flex, like this at-home gym. And so that's something to remember when we're thinking about why marketers are so big into ads, because ads tend to be pretty powerful. And I'm sure you've talked about that in your IMC class and other classes.
We can absolutely talk about motivation and motives all day long, but we have to know that there are things that get in the way of our motivation and things that get in the way of our motives, right? Um, and so one question always comes up: what can impede in motivation? Many things can impede motivation. We're going to talk about a couple. But I put these figures up because I'm trying to lose a little weight, and I'll be honest, there are things that stop my motivation to do that. One would be French fries because I love them. I don't love crinkle fries. I don't love waffle fries, but regular French fries I'm a huge fan of. So if someone offers me French fries, I'm going to have a hard time turning them away. At the same time, there are a few other things that kind of move around motivation. The other is shopping for groceries. I actually really don't like to shop for groceries. I find the supermarket to be, not my favorite place to be. Um, and there are some frustrations there, and so eating healthy food can be a bit of a challenge when you don't really like grocery shopping. On the other hand, one thing that does kind of help me when it comes to motivation is that there are many unhealthy foods that, I'm offered that I don't particularly care for. So, for example, we have coffee hour with the dean. The dean provides donuts and coffee. I'm not a huge fan of coffee. Will absolutely drink it though. But not a huge fan, and I need it to be pretty not coffee tasting, so caramel macchiato or something like this. But, I'm not really motivated to grab donuts because I don't like them that much. So, motivation ebbs, it flows. But let's talk about a few things that can impede motivation. I should mention really quickly that we'll talk about motivation, ability, and opportunity, and then I'm going to come back and really hone in on motivation because that's the big key of this lecture. So, consumer ability. We just talked about motivation in the last slide. So, when we think about consumer ability, we have to remember something, and what we need to remember is that may have the highest level of motivation ever, but it's useless unless you have ability, right? You need ability to process information, right? You got to be able to process the fact that San Morello is there. You need to make decisions to engage in certain behaviors, and frankly, you just need the resources to make an outcome that you desire happen. So, one resource that you would need are financial resources. So, I talked about San Morello. San Morello is really expensive, or pretty expensive compared to maybe a lot of chains or other places. So, I'll give you an example. When San Morello first went up, it was in the news, and I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in this apartment, and she said, "Why would I go there and spend that kind of money when I can just make an Italian dish that I like at home, and pasta is like $1?" Fair point. right? I don't really have an argument against her point. But it's funny because a friend of mine visited me from New York, and the first thing she wanted to do was go to San Morello, right? So San Morello is expensive. My friend was a little bit more used to it because she lives in Manhattan, and she's used to paying more expensive prices for food. But for a lot of people, they might not have the ability to pay a lot, or they may not want to, right? A savings account is a good thing. You also need the cognitive ability, right? So you need to be able to. Another piece to the ability puzzle, another resource is emotional ability. A consumer's ability to be empathetic and sympathetic can absolutely affect how they process information and decisions about things like brand choices, consumption, disposition or disposing of products, spending, so on and so forth. For example, I have a paper in Cornell Hospitality Quarterly where we look at how a person's empathy level affect how they evaluate services, right? So if you're a more empathetic person, right, you're more likely to be generous when you're evaluating a service, even if there was a service failure. So the example that we used was, say you're taking a trip and your travel agent made a mistake. How upset will you be? Well, it turns out if you're empathetic, you will be significantly less upset, and you will be significantly more likely to appreciate your travel agent than if you have very little empathy. I think this is important to remember at a time like this. We have so many service workers, as you can see in this picture, so many service workers and government workers who are out here trying to help us. But if you don't have a lot of empathy or sympathy, you may not be appreciative of the doctor or the garbage man who, God bless garbage men, God bless them, of the person who's doing grocery delivery or the person who's delivering your FedEx package, so on and so forth. It's also important to think about social and cultural resources, right? So, cultural knowledge that you might have, your social relationships, a lot of times those things affect your acquisition, consumption, and disposition behavior as well. And we could think of a lot of things. Maybe your religion is a resource and it affects how you consume or dispose of things. So, for example, some religions believe in Sabbath day. Some people hold Sabbath on Saturday, some groups hold Sabbath on Sunday. Regardless, some people have in their religious beliefs, that they don't consume things during Sabbath, so they won't buy things, and they won't go to places that force other people to work on the Sabbath, right? So that could be something. It could be that you come from a family that is able to leave you um, an inheritance. So I think that's one thing we don't talk about a lot in the U.S. A lot of people who are able to receive an inheritance usually have a leg up on people who aren't, frankly, right? And if you are in a position where you receive an inheritance, you probably were in a position throughout your entire life to have certain resources that maybe other people don't have, and that can be a big deal in terms of affecting your ability to consume and acquire things. Other things that affect your ability, age, right? I could want to go to San Murillo if I'm 5, but if I'm 5, I doubt that they would let me in the place in the restaurant by myself. And then knowledge and education. So knowledge and education is just so problematic on so many levels. So we are in a situation now where knowledge is everywhere. If you have a cell phone, you have a computer, you can look things up, you can learn on your own. You see classes at Harvard and other places or other things on YouTube where people are willing to teach you. The problem, though, is that knowledge isn't always harnessed in a way that helps people. So, for example, let's say that John becomes a construction worker, right? Because it turns out he really liked building things. But the thing is, John would have made an excellent physicist, right? But maybe John didn't even know what a physicist was. He doesn't know what it is right now. And so that never was even on his radar. So a lot of people don't even know the options of what they can do with or without a degree, or in any other way. Which is why I asked, I think on the first day of school, on first day of classes, how many of you know the specific marketing sub discipline you want to go into? Do you want to go into digital marketing? Do you want to go into, data analytics, so on and so forth? That's something I just highly recommend that you try to figure out while you're in college, so that you know what steps you need to take to get there, when you go on the job market. So you need motivation, you need ability, and then you need the opportunity, right? So something, the final factor that affects motivation is your opportunity to engage in a behavior that can be impacted by time. Right, so you need the time to process information. So if I'm watching Netflix and they do a quick commercial for a new show, for example, they have a new one on crack cocaine, and then they have a new one on, I think, a few murders or something like this. I need time to actually watch the little blurbs about them, or to even look through Netflix's schedule, or kind of, what do you call it, index of available shows. I need to not be distracted, right? So this is a problem I personally have quite a bit. I am easily distracted. And then the other issues that affect your opportunity really are about information. If the information is complex, some people just won't get it. It is what it is. You can think about that. I mean, you could think about that in terms of math, right? Um, you might have the opportunity or the ability to sit in a calculus class, and you might have the motivation to do well, but if math is like gibberish to you, then the complexity of information will absolutely affect your opportunity to do well in the class. The amount of information, whether or not information is repetitive, and the control of information. So can you control when you receive the information? This is one thing I like about online classes. I think being able to control the information is a little bit better for students. I notice that a lot of students don't like to take notes in general. So me writing out, let's say, the weekly announcements, or, allowing you to listen to the lecture at your leisure. I think those things are really helpful. I also should mention that a report came out. I don't know if you guys took part in it, but the Illage School sent out a report asking students their thoughts about online classes, and it was pretty positive. Let me say this: the majority of students at the Illage School supported online classes and said that they prefer them, which I think put a bee in a few people's bonnets, but I do too, so I'm with you. So we talked about having motivation, ability, and opportunity. Do those things always lead to the consumption outcome that we want? That's always a big question mark. So I'm going to give us some examples in my own life. So for me, when it comes to Netflix, I have the ability, I have the opportunity. I really don't have the motivation to watch a lot of shows on Netflix. I just watch the shows that I like over and over again. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. I don't know. But I know that when I'm looking at something like Netflix, motivation is an issue for me, which means that I often don't consume much Netflix. Podcasting. So I really want to start a podcast. I cannot lie to you. This is something that's on my bucket list. The problem, so I'm definitely motivated to do it. My issue for the podcast, though, is that I don't really have the ability to do it right now. Between my health and my job, I have too much on my plate. But I'm hoping at some point, I start feeling better, and my job maybe cuts down a little bit, and I can start my podcast. I don't really have any idea what I'm going to do a podcast on, though. So just know that. Or that's another issue. So I love this example. I saw read an article the other day about people who really wanted to go to Walt Disney World during during their shutdown. So, for those of you who don't know, Walt Disney World shut down for quite a few months, actually, because of COVID-19. So there are people who are absolutely motivated, especially people who are from overseas who save up to bring their kids to Walt Disney World, but also people who are fanatics. So there are some people who go to Disney several times a year. I've met some of these people, and they are very committed. And so when Disney shut down, they didn't have the opportunity, so they weren't able to consume a trip to Disney. So again, opportunity is important. So this is probably my favorite example. So I was sitting home. I'm sick. I'm by myself. And one day I decided to order Uber Eats. I had the motivation, the ability, the opportunity to order Uber Eats. I will admit to you, I don't want to sound like a fuddy-duddy, but I've never ordered Uber Eats before. Literally, never used them. But I was like, listen, I'm at home. All I have really that I feel like cooking is soup. I have a ton of soup. I'm eating this soup. I'm over soup. Let me order this Uber Eats. TLDR, I did not order Uber Eats. So again, I had the motivation, I had the ability, I had the opportunity until I place my order. So I get on the app. I'm picking out what I want. I order food that I normally get from a restaurant that is normally around 30 bucks, right? So I put my 30 bucks in the cart. By the time they upcharge me for the food, a service fee, a delivery fee, taxes, and a tip, I would have been paying almost $75 for this one meal. And I just couldn't do it. Like, I don't consider myself cheap, but I do try to think about value, and I just didn't think it was worth it. And I felt bad because I was like, apparently, I'm just not with it enough to do it, but I just wasn't able to do it. So, from that example, I want to show you that even sometimes when you have the motivation, you have the ability, and you have the opportunity, sometimes you still don't make the consumption choice, right? That can happen too, right? So we saw instances where maybe you don't have the motivation, you don't have the ability, or you don't have the opportunity. But sometimes you have all three and you still don't make the consumption decision. And this is something that marketers try to figure out. So if I'm Uber Eats, I'm wondering, why did she put the food in her cart but never proceed to check out? What stopped her? So it's difficult to discuss involvement, or I'm sorry, motivation without discussing involvement. So involvement refers to the degree of information processing that you do. So we'll talk about this in another class, whether your processing is simple or whether you elaborate. But another definition of involvement is just personal relevance. So the importance that a customer or consumer attaches to a product or market offering. You should know that the degree of involvement or personal relevance has a very significant effect on consumer behavior. I said it before, I am very involved when it comes to funnel cakes, and I've actually, gone to festivals to, buy funnel cakes. So consumer behavior right there. See, I'm proving them right. So I'm not going to go over this entire slide, but I'm going to talk about some things that I think are important. When we think about involvement and conceptualizing involvement, first we have to figure out what precedes involvement. What is an antecedent? And it could be personal factors, whether it's needs, values, interest. It could be other stimulus factors, the source of the communication, content of communication that the person sees. These kind of things will impact involvement with ads, with products, with purchase discounts or purchase decisions, so on and so forth. But that involvement then will lead to its own level or types of outcome. The amount of search, information search, the influence of price on brand, so on and so forth. So involvement tends to be, again, really important. One of the things that marketers really like to talk about when it comes to involvement is involvement's impact on search, right? You're not going to buy a product if you don't have some level of search for the product, right? Or market offering, right? Product, service, idea, so on and so forth. If you have low involvement or low personal relevance when it comes to a product or market offering, you are going to engage in simple problem solving. You are going to have minimal search for external information. You're not going to really evaluate product claims, and you more than likely will only consider a few brands. So, for example, you could have low involvement with a lot of the things you buy on Amazon. Let's say, you're buying um, colored pencils and chalk. I don't know, anything that you're buying. Um, you might not take the extra step of looking at an algorithm to see if the reviews or customer reviews are, legit. There are some companies that have these algorithms. So, for example, when I use Amazon, which I try not to use it too much, but whenever, although I am an Amazon Prime member, so I'm a little all over the place there. But when I use Amazon, I usually go to fakespot.com, which is an algorithm that tries to detect whether or not the reviews for the product that I'm looking at is fake. And I do it not necessarily because I have low in or high involvement with what I'm buying, but I am highly involved with Amazon, because I understand that Amazon could be tricking me, so on and so forth. Anyway, when you have high involvement, as you can probably tell from my example, you engage in more problem solving, more complex problem solving. You consider certain trade offs. You have a substantial search for information. And for some people, just putting the website in fakespot.com to verify algorithms would be considered more substantial, as opposed to just looking at what Amazon reviews say. You have a critical evaluation of marketing claims, right? Not all marketing claims are honest. And you may consider many brands or alternatives. Oftentimes, when we talk about low involvement and high involvement, we're talking about things that remain fairly stable. You might have a high involvement with your house or a high involvement with your kids or so on and so forth. But for things that are temporary, involvement that is temporary, we like to say that you could have felt involvement, which is considered a motivational state that affects the extent and focus of a consumer's attention and their comprehension, and the meanings that are produced from those things. And you might have felt involvement after watching a television ad or talking to your family or talking to your friends. But again, it's a temporary state. So it could be that, like, you see this commercial and they're talking about watches and how a specific watch is amazing. And you might look at that and go, oh my God, that watch is amazing. I've had some issues with my watch. Should I go ahead and buy it? I should go ahead and buy it, right? Okay, that might be a temporary state because you say, "Oh, I should go ahead and buy it," and then you never buy it. Or you buy it immediately and you don't really think about it too much after you buy it, right? So, again, it's a temporary state.
So I just mentioned that involvement can affect kind of how you process an ad, whether you just engage in kind of simple cues where you just kind of pay attention to just very simple elements of the ad, or you engage in elaboration where you actually try to link what you already know with information that's provided by that ad. We can also say that involvement is a continuum, right? It starts or kind of at the low level of involvement, you would say there's some level of inertia, right? So consumers lack the motivation to consider alternatives. This happens a lot. It could be one of those things where, you know, your shampoo is okay, but you're not really a big shampoo person. You don't really care about shampoo. You just have to use it a couple times a week, and so it's okay. It's not great, but you're not going to buy anything else because you don't really care about shampoo. On the other hand, you could be in what they call a flow state, where you're highly involved in the consumption experience. So you're truly involved with the product, the ad, or the website. So, for example, I would argue that the guy who gets a Harley Davidson tattoo uh, is truly involved with the product. So they are in flow state when it comes to Harley Davidson.